which is obviously confusing for staff members. So what they did is they made a recommendation that each...
In behind the mic, sir, the sound won't be picked up, lads.
Okay.
Sorry.
Shall I start again?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Welcome everyone to the Conflict of Interest workshop, and what I'd like to do is just set out the context for what actually and why we're here today. So in 2017, the Higher Education Authority and Knowledge Transfer Ireland commissioned a report into the practices around intellectual property and conflict of interest in the universities and in the IoTs. What they found was that there was a significant gap with respect to conflict of interest, in that some institutes didn't have a conflict of interest policy, whereas other institutes and universities had multiple conflicting conflict of interest policies. So some institutes had up to 33 policies referring to conflict of interest, which is obviously confusing for staff within the institutes. So what they did, what IP Pragmatics did, is they made a recommendation, or a series of recommendations, and one of those recommendations we're going to try address today through our own policy and through this workshop, was to have a single institute's policy on conflict of interest. And what the HEA did is the HEA recommended that all of the institutes put in place this conflict of interest policy. That came to us in 2018. Prior to that, in 2015, we had begun some work in relation to conflict of interest. And what we did is we put in place, using a legal firm called Beecham's, we put in place conflict of interest policy. We waited until the output of the HEA KTI report, and we implemented the policy in May of this year. So May of 2018, we put the policy in place. And through, I suppose, feedback and consultation with different stakeholder groups, what we found was that there was a requirement to have an engagement and some training around conflict of interest. It's new. How will it be implemented? What will be done? Give us some examples. And so today what we have is, we have David McBeth. He's going to talk us through conflict of interest, the different types of conflict of interest, and give some examples. And I'll allow David to introduce himself and sort of set the scene. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James. So, as James says, I'm David McBeth, and I am currently the Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange Services at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. I've been there for almost 20 years, but I'm actually leaving there to go to the University of York in England in February, which means I'm kind of slightly between affiliations as I speak to you today. Prior to working at Strathclyde, I also worked for a few years as the Director of the Research Office in Edinburgh Napier University. And over this time working in the higher education sector in roles that exposed me to conflict of interest type situations quite often, I've developed a personal interest in conflict of interest policies, also in intellectual property policies as applied in universities and institutes. And as a result of that, I've been invited to speak here today, and I'll explain in a minute or two. It was a bit of a circuitous route by which I came to be speaking to you, but I think, in all honesty, there aren't that many people out there that have a special interest in this kind of stuff. So I think finding a speaker maybe was initially quite challenging for people, but I'm always game, so I'll try my best to provide that in this talk. So I think, reflecting on what James just said, why does this institute need a policy? Well, the primary purpose, or the primary reason rather, is that the institute is a public body that was created under the Institute of Technology Act 2006. So it's required to comply with various acts and laws that are applicable to public bodies. And then that's been supplemented, as James explained, by the Knowledge Transfer Ireland and Higher Education Authority review of IP management and conflicts of interest, which was done in 2017. And they all require the Institute to address its own conflicts of interest and all the conflicts of interest of its staff, its students and associates. And by associates, we mean particularly people such as consultants who might be working in an exclusive capacity for the Institute for a time-limited period. Also, we mean people like visiting professors, perhaps, who are not employees of the Institute, but who are working at the Institute and will have some of the same characteristics as employees of the Institute. And to go back to the circuitous process by which I ended up standing here, Celine found my name as a result of a presentation that I gave about conflict of interest in a more narrow context of technology transfer at University College Cork last May. So that's really how I came to be found. So what is a conflict of interest by the purposes of the policy? The key thing is that the interests of an individual person may be in conflict or perceived to be in conflict with the institute, with the interests of the institute. And in particular, that the interests of the person might make the person either make a decision that is unfairly favourable to some person or organisation that the individual has a relationship with, or might make the person make a decision that is unfairly unfavourable to the institute as a result of that relationship which they have. And it's very, very important in relation to conflict of interest to understand that it's an area where perception is reality. I mean, people say perception is reality about a lot of things, but it's particularly true for conflict of interest. It doesn't need to be real. If the outside world would perceive it as conflicted behaviour, then it's very, very important to identify it and manage it. And that's why the definition that's in the conflict of interest policy that's been produced here makes it clear that it's an actual or a perceived or a potential conflict of interest that the policy applies to. So I think, as I've already said, the policy in theory applies to everyone, because everyone could make a decision in theory, again, that might be either unfairly favourable to someone outside the place or might be unfair and detrimental to the place. So all staff of all kinds, all other people whose work at the Institute might expose them to conflict of interest situations, students, particularly probably postgraduate research students, and as I said before, associates, people like consultants that might be working for the Institute on a time-limited piece of work, people who might be visiting professors, visiting teaching fellows, that kind of thing. I suppose it's fair to say, and I'll probably say this again before I'm finished, that there are some groups, I think, for whom it's really, really important that they have a high level of awareness of the conflict of interest policy. And I think those types of people would be typically heads of departments or managers who make decisions that could have an influence on outside organisations. I think it's particularly applicable to all the people who are active participants in research, including research supervisors, including postgraduate research students. And I think it's particularly applicable to staff of professional services parts of the Institute that deal with outside bodies. So people who are involved in buying things, people who are involved in selling the Institute's services, people who are involved in the tech transfer office. Those are the main groups I think that it's really, really important that the awareness of the policy does touch, because those are the groups that I think on the whole tend to be most exposed to these types of conflict situations. Now, something that's very important to say about the Institute's conflict of interest policy, and I think it will be true of most institutes in Ireland, I think it will be true of most universities in the UK, is it's a principles-based policy. And when I say a principles-based policy, I'm putting that in contrast to a rules-based policy. So a rules-based policy would say, if X, then Y in all circumstances. A principles-based policy says, we have a set of principles and we'll treat each case on its merits. And the 4 principles of the policy, these are general, or rather generic principles of conflict of interest policies, are these ones here. So first of all, identify. Secondly, disclose. Third, manage. And fourth, record. And these principles typically would apply in most conflict of interest policies in the UK and Ireland. So the first stage, identify. So identifying potential conflicts of interest is everybody's responsibility, but the heaviest burden falls on the individual, and that's the way it should be. The key thing should be that a person who is exposed to the potential for conflict of interest should be able to recognise it, and it's always best if the individual does recognise it for themselves rather than have it pointed out to them by someone else. And that's really one of the key reasons for this training session today, is that, refer to the policy and remember that there's frequently asked questions that are going to be provided as well, and there's this training session which is being videoed. Refer to this if in doubt, if you're thinking as an individual that there might be a conflict affecting you. That's the key message, because the onus for identification is primarily on the individual. The second thing is disclose it. And again, this again is the second stage in that diagram, is another stage where the primary responsibility is on the individual. Disclose the potential conflict of interest to whoever your superior is, basically. Typically line manager, typically head of department. In some cases it might be the research group leader if you're a research associate or a postgraduate research student. If you're an undergraduate student, it might be your course leader or something like that. I mean, I can't think of that many scenarios where an undergraduate student would be conflicted, to be honest, but that's the type of person that conflict should be disclosed to. And again, the idea is, first and foremost, get face-to-face with that person and have a discussion about the potential conflict of interest. And determine, using that discussion, if the conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest requires to be managed or not. And at that stage, it might be appropriate for the senior person, the line manager, head of department or whatever, to solicit some advice from human resources or from the tech transfer office as appropriate, to maybe help make that decision about whether it, first of all, whether it is a conflict or not, and secondly, about whether or not it requires to be managed or not. And again, the flavour is openness, talk about it, form a view about it. It's not you must do X, you must do Y. It's have a conversation and establish the lay of the land. Manage, the third stage. This is the stage where the responsibility starts to shift from the individual to the individual's line manager or superior. So if a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest is to be managed, then the responsibility for managing it is a joint responsibility between the person who has the potential conflict and that person's line manager, supervisor, or whatever. And again, in taking decisions about how to manage something, I'd encourage people to refer to the policy, I'd encourage them to refer to the frequently asked questions, and obviously to this presentation as well. And I would say that when I get further into the presentation, I come to case study examples. They're intended again to help people think about how they would manage a situation should that situation arise. So that's a big part of what this presentation is actually about. And I think, unless it's really, really obvious what needs to be done, and sometimes it is obvious, sometimes it is just that person would have to make a decision where they were conflicted, so they get taken out of that decision-making process and someone else in the institution, either superior or independent, gets to take the decision. That's sometimes a complete no-brainer. You just do that, that's the management strategy, but oftentimes it might be a bit more complicated than that, and again, people should contact Human Resources and or the Technology Transfer Office to get some advice about how to manage conflicts. But if a conflict of interest has been identified, or even if it's a potential conflict of interest that people feel is significant enough to require to be managed, then it's always got to be recorded in a conflict register. And this is something that is completely the responsibility of the head of department to be responsible for. Conflict registers are something that will be, if you like, aggregated up to institute level and would be reviewed annually. I believe that templates are going to be generated on which individual conflicts and potential conflicts can be recorded for the purposes of a register, so that the material is presented in a consistent way, that it can be aggregated up, and I would suggest that would be a good way to do it. And the important thing also about conflict of interest registers is that they have to be dynamic to some extent. So when the conflict of interest ends, all reference to it should be removed from the relevant conflict register at the end of the academic year in which the conflict ends. And that might be, it could be the ending of a personal relationship, it could be the ending of a business relationship, it could be the end of a particular project. But it is important that if something's on a conflict register and it's no longer appropriate, that there is a mechanism for taking it away. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with something that's dead and that no one really pays very much attention to. And it might be unfair to the individuals whose names are on the register because they no longer have a conflict or a potential conflict. So those are basically the principles and the processes that lie behind the Institute's conflict of interest policy. And what I'm going to talk about now are 7 case study examples that I've devised these to shed some light on some of the issues. They're not all cast iron conflicts of interest, but they're all things that could be touched on by the conflict of interest policy and that you might need to think about. So the first one is this person here, who is, I'm calling Research Professor A, and the thing on the left is a large spectrometer. It's supposed to be, I don't really know if it's a spectrometer or not, but it looks quite fancy. This case study is about my trusted supplier. So Research Professor A wants to replace a spectrometer in her laboratory. And the new one, which costs €175,000, has been budgeted for in the latest grant that she won. So the money's there to purchase the spectrometer. Professor A wants to use her usual supplier. This is SpectroCo, and here's some statements that she's making. Of course there are other providers out there, but SpectroCo are the best. You can ask anyone. SpectroCo are always giving me free consumables and things, and they only work on SpectroCo machines. They wouldn't work on someone else's. I've built my entire career and done my work on SpectroCo machines, subtext I can't change now. And I'm always well treated by SpectroCo at conferences and trade fairs and so forth. Their hospitality's first class. So these are the kind of statements that Professor A has been making. And I think the idea here is to reflect on what might be the correct treatment of this. So this is a case where the individual is being given the sort of benefit of the doubt, and I'm saying that Research Professor A identifies that she might actually have a conflict of interest, and she discloses this correctly and has a discussion with her head of department. And it's taken into account 2 policies here, I think the conflict of interest policy and also the procurement procedures. Because at that kind of price, this is something that would have to be tendered under the procurement procedures come whatever, it's not something that you could just go and buy. And then I think they need to have a discussion then about whether Research Professor A really has a potential conflict of interest or not. I think if and I mean again, I'm not saying this is black and white, I'm just giving you a couple of senses of this. If Research Professor A is really majoring on the technical features and the performance of the instrument in most of her comments, then it might be that she doesn't actually have a conflict, and that it's just a kind of perception management issue. But if she's majoring on those other things that I mentioned about the hospitality and the trade fairs and the free consumables and all that kind of stuff, then I think it's fairly clear that she is conflicted, and therefore it probably does need to be managed as a conflict of interest, irrespective of whatever other management options need to be adopted. But that won't be clear until the conversation happens, until it's actually the conversation happens in the context of these policies. So if it's decided that Professor A does have a conflict or a potential conflict, then I think it's sensible to put it on a conflict of interest register, and I think it would be more than sensible. I think it would be practically required to have someone senior or independent from Research Professor A involved at a significant level in the purchasing decision. And then the actual purchasing needs to be done using an open tendering process in line with the procurement procedures. And of course, it's very, very important in that context to pay attention to the technical specifications, because it's got to be a machine that meets Professor A's technical requirements. Those are the things that she has promised the funder that's awarded her the grant that she'll be able to deliver on. So I think what I said yesterday when I gave this the first time is, if it ends up that a SpectroCo instrument is bought, that's not necessarily a bad thing or a wrong thing. That could very well be the right thing, and I'm sure probably in many cases it is the right thing, but it has to be done the right way. And that's the key thing that needs to be taken into account. It has to be done the right way. So I'm not 100% sure if that is really a conflict of interest that I've just described, but it's the type of conversation that needs to happen in that type of situation. Case study 2, business hospitality. As I said yesterday, these guys, I've been searching the internet at high speed, finding pictures that seem to match the case study. So I do apologise for these 1980s Wall Street guys enjoying their champagne. I'm not suggesting for a second that that's what goes on in Waterford Institute of Technology. So the scenario here is a little different. Head of Department B, it's quite simple really. This is Head of Department B speaking, not me. My department has to have a lot of industry engagement as part of our overall strategy. We like to deal with employers of potential students. We need to know what's happening in those companies. Companies fund our research. We want to get more industry research, so we have people over to see what we can do, show them our capability. We've been put under pressure from Enterprise Island and so forth to have people come who are maybe thinking about locating here to have their companies. So we've always got industry visitors. And of course, when we've got industry visitors, we always do our best to show them great hospitality if they're here overnight. Typically, a couple of staff from my department take the visitors out for a meal and a few drinks. We always use the City Merchant restaurant. Food there's great. Everybody says it's the best place in town, and the owner's my best pal from high school. So there's a situation that I don't think is particularly uncommon in universities in my experience. I think the correct treatment here is this. That the head of department should realise that if this use of this one restaurant above all others is done on a sustained basis, he or she might be exposed to a conflict of interest as a result of the perception that his or her personal relationship with the owner lies behind the institute's repeated use of the restaurant. So this should really be disclosed as a conflict of interest to the dean for discussion. I'm assuming the dean is what's above a head of department. My apologies if it's something else. I think that the conflict in this case should be recognised in the conflict register because it's been something that's been going on a sustained basis for quite a while, and it probably makes sense that that is put up front. But it's interesting again that there could be different management strategies for a situation like this. They could just agree between the dean and the head of department that what happens is that the hospitality gets spread around. So you're not allowed to spend it all with that one place. You're just going to have to spread it around. You're going to have to pick 3 or 4 places that you use and spread the money around. That would be one management strategy. Or an alternative could be to actually say, well, if you really do believe that's the best place in town and you really do have a steady level of business that you want to put there, you should tender for the restaurant service. You might even get to use the place that you regard as the best more cost effectively than we do at the moment. So there's not only one way to manage that, but I do think that would be seen as a potential conflict of interest and should be managed. Moving on to case study 3, again, I would say this is something that's not unusual. It's absolutely not. It's something I would say that happens frequently, and in fact we were talking about a specific example this very morning that was current, so I think that can say that this is quite frequent. And this one's called The Best Student I Ever Had. So here we have a research academic who's just won a new Horizon 2020 award and needs to appoint a research fellow to work on it. So that's a person who will be an employee of the institute. Research academic Y contacts human resources and says, I want to appoint Mary straight away. She's the best PhD student I've ever had, and the timing of this grant means she can start next month as soon as her PhD finishes. I've not written a job description of anything yet, but I've told Mary it's her job. So that is not an unusual situation in my experience. So I think this is one where the correct treatment could be, doesn't need to be, but they need to talk. The key thing is disclose and discuss. That's the most important thing. Human resources or research academic Y should invoke the conflict of interest policy to provoke a discussion with the head of department. And it might be that they decide there is no conflict of interest there, but because it might just be that research academic Y genuinely believes that Mary is by far the best candidate for this job, and there's nothing more to it than that. It might be that Research Academic Y has got a relationship with Mary that goes beyond a supervisor and student relationship. It may be that Mary's her cousin or something like that. We don't know. That's why we have the conversation. But it may be that they decide collectively there's no conflict of interest that needs to go in the conflict register so long as the following steps are taken. The job's advertised in a way that would allow other relevant candidates to apply. The interview panel is chaired by the head of department or the department research director or something like that, so that Research Academic Y is not the chairperson, and that the Research Academic Y needs to tell Mary, listen, I maybe got a bit ahead of myself there. This is going to have to be advertised. It might not be advertised for long. It might not have a long closing date, but we're going to have to do it. But the conflict of interest policy in this case has provided the context for resolution of the issue. There's been a conversation, an appropriate conversation, and there's been an appropriate way of dealing with the situation identified, which probably doesn't need to go in a conflict of interest register, because probably, thanks very much, 9 times out of 10, the genuine position of that person, Research Academic Y, is just that this is a really good candidate for the role that I have. Thank you. So, case study number 4. And this is, again, talk about stereotypical sort of images. This is your, spin-out company as the route to the Ferrari in the car park kind of thing, the sort of envy situation. And this one's called spin-off or skim-off. So here we have a situation. Professor X, I want to form a spin-out company. The spin-out company's business will be a service doing research contracts based on my knowledge. I know all the companies that would be customers for this because I've worked in this field for many years, and they all know me. They know I'm the best at delivering this kind of stuff, but they don't like working with universities and institutes. They're too expensive, they're too slow, too bureaucratic. That's not the way these companies do business. Professor X talks to the Tech Transfer Office about this, puts forward his business plan. Business plan's a bit on the vague side, just says there's a very big market for this kind of thing in the world, and here's the kind of overall global market size. And we're sure to be able to pick up a decent proportion of this business. And then at the end of that conversation, and the company will trade from my lab rent-free. Is that okay? So I think that's a situation that certainly you've probably seen, James, and I've certainly seen many times. So the correct treatment here, I think, is that Professor X should identify that his ideas have the potential to create a conflict of interest, and he should discuss this possibility and disclose it with both the head of department and the Tech Transfer Office. And this is an interesting one, and it's quite deliberate that I've included this example, because the Institute's potentially a little bit conflicted here as well. On the one hand, there's a desire for more research income directly into the Institute in order to meet targets, demonstrate impact, etc. But on the other hand, the Institute also has an expectation that spin-out companies will be formed where it's appropriate. And these things are very rarely something that's absolutely crystal clear. This must be contract research, this must be a spin-out company. There can usually be a degree of shades of grey around about that. So there's a kind of conflict, or at least a tension, that the Institute has to try to manage in itself as well. So I think the objective here would be that the conversation between the Professor X, his head of department, and the Tech Transfer Office should lead to an in-principle decision about whether forming a spin-out company is a good idea or a bad idea in this particular set of circumstances. And the kind of things that might mitigate in favour of it being a good idea would be if the services that are going to be provided, for instance, need to be need insurance cover that maybe the Institute doesn't currently have, and that might be easier for a company to purchase and manage the insurance aspects that are associated with the warranties and so forth that a company might provide to its customers. Also in relation to the setting up perhaps of quality assurance procedures, which might be difficult in a university lab environment, but which can be done in a more controlled way in a company environment, and that the customers, again, of these services might require that things are, whatever it might be, ISO 9001 or whatever the appropriate quality standards are. So there could be all sorts of reasons why forming a spin-out company is a good idea. But these need to come out in the discussion. You know, they're not just things to be just accepted. And if creation of a spin-out company is agreed, then Professor X's conflict of interest will need to be managed via, I would suggest, a formal management plan agreed between that person, Professor X, his head of department, and the Tech Transfer Office. And that plan should be recorded as well in the conflict of interest register, because once that company is set up, assuming Professor X continues to have a significant involvement with it, that is a conflict that needs to be managed. If it's been managed well, that's great, but it is a conflict. And one of the key things, of course, going back to that final point about free access, is if creation of a spin-out is agreed the right way to do things, then the terms of the agreement need to include payment for access to institute staff, services and space. And that again comes back to, is it a business? Because if it can't trade without free access to institute staff and space, then it's not a business to start with. So it's good. So that's got to be factored into the discussion. Okay, number 5. Once again, courtesy of freely available images from the internet. The person on the left here is Caroline, who's a business development officer in the Tech Transfer Office. And the person on the right is Brian, her husband, who's a professor of pharmaceutical chemistry in the Institute, even though I don't know if you do that, but anyway. So they actually met through their work, and over the years it's made sense for Caroline to be the liaison person with Brian's research group, which has got a portfolio of industry research contracts. But a situation has arisen with one of the companies that sponsor Brian's research. This is an American company called General Solutions. General Solutions has sponsored Brian's research group's work for several years, and the project's gone really, really well. The company wants to sponsor the next phase of the project, and there's a hope that the next phase of this project might actually lead to a drug candidate. But General Solutions has indicated that it can no longer afford really to pay the level of price that the Institute's been charging it for the first phase of the research project. Caroline knows, because obviously her and Brian have been out to dinner with colleagues from the R&D division of General Solutions when they've been over there and so forth, and there's no doubt that the R&D director at General Solutions has got a smaller budget. So Caroline feels strongly that the Institute should agree to the reduced pricing suggested by the company. Otherwise, Brian's group stands to lose on a really, really important collaborative research project that's been going well. So the correct treatment here is Caroline should declare her potential conflict of interest to the head of the Tech Transfer Office. And it's real, I think, so that needs to be recorded in the conflict register, and Caroline herself should be removed from the negotiation with General Solutions because she's conflicted. And my view would be that the head of the Tech Transfer Office should discuss this with the head of the Pharmaceutical Chemistry Department, and maybe people higher up in the university, maybe Vice President Research or something like that, about what is the overall importance of the General Solutions project and the extent to which the price might be varied to keep the business. If the first phase of the project has gone as well as everyone has said, and if it is a genuine reality that there's a really strong potential of a good result from the rest of the project, and the company genuinely does want to negotiate a price change that could be reasonable, then the institution might decide that it's worth accepting a lower price for this work, but that can't be a decision that Caroline takes because she's conflicted, and that's it. So that, in some ways, I think that's quite a simple one. Again, it's not that unusual in my experience, that kind of thing. Even in much bigger places, these types of situations have occurred frequently. Case study 6, charity begins at home. Lots of people sitting enjoying hospitality at a black tie dinner. So this is the scenario here. Head of Department Z has worked at the Institute for over 30 years and is well connected in the civic life of the city beyond the Institute. So this is a person who's very much part of the life of the city beyond WIT. And for the last 10 years, Zed has been the chair of the Board of Trustees of a children's charity, which is local to the region. In a good year, the charity might donate tens of thousands of euros to local hospitals and children's homes for children's welfare on the back of its fundraising efforts. And these fundraising efforts have become a bit like a well-oiled machine in the modern era, with 2 significant, prestigious annual black tie dinners. These dinners are hosted in Zed's department's main hall. Zed doesn't charge the charity for use of the hall, and he puts the catering against his department's running costs as well, so the charity doesn't need to pay for that either. Zed feels this is perfectly reasonable, and that the Institute would be more than supportive of the charity's goals. You know, who could have anything against helping children who are in hospital or who are in care? And in fact, he's had lots and lots of complimentary statements made to him at the dinners about the Institute's hospitality towards the charity. So I would say that this is a scenario where the person is, completely happy with the arrangement that pertains. So I think this is one where the correct treatment. I'm taking quite a hard line in this scenario. I mean, Zed should have disclosed his conflict of interest to his relevant dean or vice president here, and he should have agreed with the dean or vice president that he should be removed from making decisions in relation to the future of institute facilities or staff by the charity. Obviously, one would have hoped that he should also have made the best case he could that the Institute would continue to support these charitable activities, given how much good press it might potentially bring on the Institute, and given how it might well fit in with the Institute's corporate social responsibility or whatever, but it isn't a decision he should be making himself. His conflict of interest should have been recorded in the conflict register for as long as he's a trustee of the charity. And in this case, as I said, I'm taking a bit of a hard line. This is clearly something that's been going on for a few years. I think this is a situation where if it was in my institution, which it isn't, there would be the possibility of disciplinary action in this case, because this is a conflict that has existed. It's not been potential, it's been absolutely real, and it's not been managed for a considerable amount of time. The individual has allowed the conflict to persist in a way that's actually to the detriment of the Institute, and potentially to the detriment of his or her own reputation as well. So there's a degree of stupidity wrapped up in this one, as well as a degree of conflict. Case study 7, and as I said yesterday, again, this is intended to look like a worried PhD student. I don't know if the guy looks worried enough, to be honest, but the idea is here that this is someone feeling the pressure, and the title of this one is "My Job Prospects Hinge on This Project." So that guy in the photograph was Jack. He's a second-year PhD student, and his studentship's part funded by ABC Limited. He's got an industrial supervisor in England, where ABC Limited are based, and he's also got an institute supervisor here. Every year, Jack spends 2 6-week periods over at ABC Limited's R&D centre over in England. It's just part of his studentship that happens. And while he was last over at ABC, the R&D director there, who's the boss of his industrial supervisor, took him aside at a social thing and said, there could be a career for you here if this project of yours goes well. But the reality is that Jack's project hasn't been going particularly well. It's been struggling a bit. The results haven't been turning out the way that ABC Limited would want, that's for sure. And they're certainly not really looking to Jack as if they're going to give him a very good PhD either, if things continue the way they are at the moment. So the pressure is building, and Jack is starting to feel tempted to adjust some of the results because no one's really checking. So the correct treatment here is that Jack should contact his institute supervisor straight away and just be open about the situation. He doesn't particularly need to invoke the conflict of interest policy, and realistically I'm not sure he would necessarily know about it. His supervisor should, in my opinion, but share this situation. Even if he doesn't realise it, his supervisor should realise Jack has become conflicted here, as a result of these inappropriate comments from this R&D director when he's been over in England. And what should happen first and foremost is that the supervisor and Jack should agree that their primary obligation, above all others, under the Code of Conduct for the Responsible Practice of Research, and I know that that isn't live yet, I understand that's going to be live in February 2019, is to conduct the research with integrity and do the research in a way that is appropriate and shows integrity, is appropriately ethical, and that's the primary guiding feature, if you like, of the decision that needs to be made. I think the supervisor should recognise that Jack's potential conflict of interest should be recorded in the relevant conflict register, and I would say that the main management, beyond continuing to operate with integrity, is to get an agreement with the industrial supervisor over ABC about the types of communications that are appropriate in relation to the project, and those should be, I would suggest, the main communications there should be between ABC Limited and Jack should only be in relation to Jack's provision of progress reports to ABC and participations and discussions with his industrial supervisor about the progress of the individual project. And that can be done because, to be honest, I've been in that position myself. So, I think that that's the best way to deal with it. And I suppose if the same kind of comment was to be made again to Jack by the R&D director of ABC, then that might really be something that the institute has to complain about, because it's not giving the student the appropriate environment in which to do his studies. And that is the end of the presentation. So I'm very happy to take questions and answers. But again, I would restate, these examples are more intended to kind of provoke thought. They're not intended to say this is how you must do something. It's just about these are scenarios that I think are quite common and that could be related to the guidance that's provided in the conflict of interest policy. Thanks. Thank you.